Phil Amidon was born August 22, 1943 in Chicago. Our mother Celia was an immigrant from Holland, caught up in the war and unable to return to her native country. She came from a very devout Catholic family. Our father Horace, also known as Ben, was from a small town in Iowa and a printer by trade. He was Methodist. Both were living in a boarding house in Chicago. Celia survived by giving piano lessons, while Horace worked as a pressman at the Chicago Tribune. The story is that Horace worked a night shift. Celia's piano playing during the day kept him awake, so he complained to the landlady. Hence they met and fell in love. Celia was quite worried about their religious differences, so she went to ask the advice of a good-natured parish priest with whom she drank a glass of wine. Any kind of discussion with family or friends abroad was impossible, because the Netherlands was completely cut off by the German occupation, so she had to make the decision herself. Perhaps hastened by the attack on Pearl Harbor, the couple married on December 17, 1941, at St.Johns Birchman's Church in Chicago. Horace was soon drafted. When Phil was born, his father was in Algiers as part of an army unit assigned to record war casualties. Horace returned in 1945 and saw Philip for the first time. Philip was 2 years old. In 1947, Celia gave birth to my twin brother Hollis and me. Shortly afterward, Horace quietly converted to Catholicism. A family story is told that Phil announced when he was 5 years old that he was going to be a priest when he grew up. Having gone from being the sole focus of his mother, who spoke Dutch, to suddenly having to share his mother's affections with a strange man who only spoke English, to the arrival of twins, perhaps that story isn't so far-fetched. In 1949, the family moved to Burlington, Iowa, where Horace worked for the local newspaper. Phil attended the elementary school at St. John's Parish. In 1952, Horace purchased The Economist, a weekly newspaper in the small town of Solon, Iowa. Phil excelled in school, played the trombone in the school band, and served as an altar boy at St. Mary's Catholic Church. At some time in his youth, he was stricken with polio. Although he made a full recovery, this illness no doubt made it difficult for him to be very physically active at a time when most young boys would be engaged in sports and outdoor play. He spent a good deal of his time reading, which probably contributed to his love of scholarly pursuits. When Phil was 15, he began writing a column in the Solon newspaper from the viewpoint of our family cat, Durwood. I've always marveled that Dad allowed him the column space. Topics ranged from the weather to local sports to the Cold War. Somewhat prophetically, in 1958, he wondered if the global climate was changing. Phil attended high school at Regina in Iowa City, which had just opened for Catholics in the community. When he was a senior, he announced his intentions to become a Jesuit. Our parents suggested that he delay this decision for a year, as the commitment is so challenging. But Phil was adamant and entered the novitiate at St. Bonifacius in Minnesota in 1961, shortly after his 18th birthday. 13 years later, in 1974, he was ordained at St. Wenceslas Church in Iowa City. A huge gathering of friends and family attended, including an aunt from Holland. He continued his studies at St. Louis University and Oxford University, where he earned a Doctor of Philosophy degree with a specialty in early church literature. Phil also spent time in Israel, South Korea, and Germany before going to Creighton. When our mother died unexpectedly in 1979, our dad married an old college sweetheart, Mary Carney. Phil performed the wedding. With this new marriage, we inherited a wonderful new group of relatives. 4 of them are here today at Phil's memorial service. Thank you to Tom, Nabila, Tina, and Father Michael for representing the family during this time. Phil took a brief departure from the university in 1989 when he was reassigned to the Jesuit headquarters in Rome to do administrative work. In 1994, he returned to Creighton, where he served in pastoral ministry at St. John's Church as an adjunct assistant professor of theology and as a chaplain in the residence halls. When I married and settled in St. Paul, his response to our invitation to visit was always the same. If you're incautious enough to invite me up. Our 3 daughters adored Phil and delighted in his time with them. When they were young, they would insist on playing games with Uncle Philly. He was always happy to participate. Occasionally, it was necessary for one of them to invent a rule in order to assure victory, which Phil always tolerated with a roar of laughter. He also was invited to play imaginary games with them and their toys. His infectious laugh only served to inspire them to even more silliness. When one of them was in tears with a small finger injury and insisted on a Band-Aid, Phil applied some Scotch tape to the wound, which magically solved the problem. Phil never missed a birthday. A card arrived without fail from Uncle Philly every year for each of us. Phil was also a prolific letter writer. We wrote letters back and forth once or twice a month. He also told delightful and hilarious stories about his many travels in Europe and Asia, or about the politics of riverboat casinos plying the Missouri River. He always insisted on buying a French silk pie and taking the family out for dinner to a nice restaurant when visiting. He was particularly fond of Italian food. Having spent time in England, Phil acquired a fondness for Guinness Stout. For several years, his lunches at our home included a glass, served at room temperature. This elicited horrified comments from his nieces, who referred to the mixture as mud. Now that they're adults, all have acquired a strong liking for dark ales. Phil also introduced us to Harvey's Bristol Cream Sherry. Our evening rituals at Christmas included a fire in the fireplace, a large plate of cheese, crackers, herring, and a glass kept full. We plan to continue this practice in coming years, knowing that Phil will be with us in spirit. In 1999, when Phil celebrated 25 years in the priesthood, we surprised him with a luncheon celebration party at a lovely Italian restaurant, which included Don and Mary Ann Kelly, Susie and Mick Anderson, my wife Barb, and me. In addition to receiving a new set of vestments, Phil was given 25 bottles of Guinness, thanks to the thoughtfulness of Don Kelly. Phil had a wonderful, dry sense of humor and was a keen observer of the human condition. He was not one to stand on ceremony. Many of his letters contain descriptions of administrative conferences and requirements, of which he quickly drew weary. Phil was always the first one to retire to his room after a celebration. Phil was also very humble. In 2016, he was inducted into Alpha Sigma Nu, which seeks to identify the most promising students and honorary inductees in Jesuit institutions of higher education, who demonstrate a commitment to the ideals of Jesuit higher education, scholarship, loyalty, and service. Invitation to Alpha Sigma Nu is one of the highest honors bestowed at Jesuit institutions. When informed he would be inducted in 2016, he was somewhat less than thrilled, not because of the honor, but because he liked to avoid the limelight. In addition to teaching, Phil has also published numerous times for translating early Christian literature. Phil hated technology. Had it not evolved so quickly, he probably would have been quite happy. He stubbornly continued to use an outdated word processing program, which no doubt kept Creighton's tech support on their toes and caused his publishers to pull out their hair. Phil retired from teaching in 2018. When asked what he planned to do in retirement, his one-word answer was less. Of course, he continued his pastoral work at St.Johns Church and performing some translation work for the Augustinian Heritage Society. As Father Hendrickson said when Phil retired, "Thank you for your dedication and service." To this, his family adds, "Thank you, Phil, for being such a kind, loving, thoughtful brother and uncle. You are loved by your whole family and will be greatly missed."